Welcome to the Explainer. We're going to dive right into decoding some of the absolute most essential everyday grammar you need to sound completely natural in English. You know, if you've ever hesitated when trying to talk about rules, or give advice to a friend, or even just explain what you're obligated to do, well, you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're mastering English modal verbs of obligation and necessity. Let's get into it. So, here's our roadmap for today. First, expressing rules and advice. Second, the scale of obligation. Third, those tricky negative modals. And finally, expanding your grammar toolkit.
All right, part 1. Expressing rules and advice.
I want you to just stop and think about this for a second. How do we express rules? Like, if you want to tell someone they have an obligation, or if you just want to give a strong recommendation without sounding super unnatural or, well, too bossy, how do you actually do that? Because without modal verbs, honestly, you kind of end up sounding like a robot, just rattling off facts. Modals are the secret sauce. They give your sentences flavor, context, and that exact level of urgency you need.
Moving on to part 2, the scale of obligation. Think of this whole concept like climbing a mountain. Obligation in English doesn't just have one single speed, right? It operates on a sliding scale. And we're going to start at the very softest end of that scale with the word should. We use should for friendly advice, mild recommendations. It basically leaves a ton of room for personal choice. A great example of this is, you should spend more time outdoors instead of sitting in front of your laptop. You're just suggesting that this would be a really great thing to do. It's soft, it's helpful, and importantly, it doesn't force the other person to actually do it.
Now let's see how things build as we climb a little higher up that scale. We're looking at two heavyweights here, must and have to. And honestly, this is usually a huge aha moment for learners. You see, must represents a personal, internal drive. It's totally subjective. It's an obligation you feel inside yourself. But have to, that comes from an external perspective. The obligation is coming from the outside, like from a boss, a strict rule, or even a law.
Okay, so what does this actually look like in the real world? Let's walk through some specific examples to really anchor these concepts. First up, I must eat more vegetables to be healthier. Nobody is forcing you to eat those veggies, right? This is entirely your internal desire to improve your health. But now think about these two. I have to wear a uniform at work, and you have to be 18 to vote. See the difference? These are completely external. Your employer demands the uniform, and the government sets the voting age. You're doing the action regardless of whether you actually want to or not.
All right, on to part 3, the tricky negative modals.
Take a deep breath for this one, because making these specific verbs negative creates a massive and frankly, sometimes super confusing shift in logic. The rules we just learned totally shape when we add the word not. Take a look at this one. You mustn't park here. Or, you might also hear, you can't park cars in this area. When you make must negative, turning it into mustn't, it completely transforms into a strict rule, an absolute prohibition. It definitely does not mean you internally prefer not to, no way. It means something is entirely forbidden. Seriously, don't do it, unless you want a really expensive parking ticket.
Now, contrast that strict rule with this. You don't have to pay for the dinner. While mustn't means absolutely forbidden, don't have to means a complete lack of necessity. It's totally optional. Like, if a friend tells you you don't have to pay for the dinner, it just means you can pay if you really want to, if you insist on treating them, but you are absolutely not obligated to do it. The pressure is completely off.
This is absolutely crucial, so let's make sure we register this hard boundary. Think of prohibition, mustn't or can't, as a giant red light. It means stop, it's forbidden, end of story. But no obligation, don't have to or needn't, that's a green light for your freedom of choice. You can do the thing or not do it because it simply isn't necessary. And trust me, mixing these two up can lead to some incredibly awkward misunderstandings, so definitely keep that mental boundary strong.
And finally, part 4, expanding your grammar toolkit.
Now that we've got the core foundation totally mastered, let's look at two really handy verbs to expand your toolkit: need to and ought to. We use need to for practical, neutral, everyday requirements. Like if you run out of milk for your coffee, you need to go to the supermarket. It's just a simple, practical necessity. On the flip side, ought to is basically a slightly more formal, maybe a bit more elevated version of should. People often use it for moral advice. Like you might say, you ought to add more convincing arguments to your presentation. It just carries this weight of expectation and proper behavior.
Okay, so let's map everything we've been talking about across time, looking at past, present, and future forms. If you check out the present tense, you'll see our familiar friends: must, should, need to, have to. But if you look over to the past tense, you're going to notice that must is just completely crossed out. Why? Because must literally doesn't have a past tense form. Instead, we actually have to borrow the past tense of have to, which is had to, whenever we're talking about the past. So yesterday, you didn't must do something, you had to do it. Kind of fascinating how that works, right?
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, and honestly, you've done an awesome job navigating this whole spectrum of necessity. But before we wrap up this explainer, I've got a challenge for you. What is something you have to do tomorrow and something you don't have to do? I really want you to actively apply this grammar to your own life right now. Just build those two sentences in your head. But taking it a step beyond just the grammar, ask yourself, how many things in your life do you think you must do that you actually don't have to do? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep practicing.